Good evening. My name is Spencer McAllister, and I am a proud member and been designated by our fearless secretary, John Appleton, to host tonight's event. Unfortunately, the dinner, due to various extenuating circumstances, we are not able to gather together in person. So we are doing tonight's event virtually, and we welcome you. This is the Crown and Shield Yacht Squadron's winter dinner, if you will. So I hope you have a cocktail and ready to enjoy a wonderful presentation. I'd like to introduce you to Jeremy Detremont. I'm going to say it a little French. He may pronounce it differently, but we're going to do Detremont. Excellent. He's been called the leading expert on New England's historic lighthouses. He's the author and co-author of over 20 books on lighthouses, including aptly named Lighthouses of Maine, Lighthouses of Massachusetts, Lighthouses of Rhode Island.
Pretty clever.
Lighthouses of Connecticut. But the one that really got my attention was the great shipwrecks of the Maine coast. And that's the one I want to follow. Mm-hmm. He's done the Lighthouse Handbook, New England, All About Noble Light, Ocean-Born Mary, The Truth Behind New Hampshire Legend. Jeremy is the president and historian for the American Lighthouse Foundation. He's the founder of Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses and the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. He's appeared on the History Channel, the Travel Channel, public television, National Public Radio, speaking about lighthouses and other subjects. He also produces and hosts a weekly podcast called Lighthearted, how appropriate, for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. Now, as a little bit of format here, you will see at the bottom of your screen a question and answer, a Q&A section. We would ask that if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A section. And at the end of the presentation, we will do our very best to get to all of the questions. I want to wish you a very happy new year. And with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Jerry Detremont on his, to the inaugural and hopefully final Zoom only meeting of the Crown and Shield Yacht Squadron. Jeremy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Spencer. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Be nicer, even nicer in person, but virtually is good too. So it's a pleasure. And I don't want to waste too much time at the beginning here. I got a lot of ground to cover, and I know you're all boat people, so you're probably quite familiar with the area I'm going to talk about. So let me go into share screen here. Just give me a moment. And here we go. And you should all be seeing the title Lighthouses of Nantucket Sound on the photos on your screen. Spencer, you're seeing that, right? He's muted. So I'm hoping you can all yes, see that on your screen.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, it's on my screen.
Even though I know I did it right, but I never trust the technology. I always have to ask. But anyway, so here are the lighthouses I'm going to be talking about. And let me show you a map. I probably don't need to show you a map because, like I said, I think you're all familiar with these lighthouses or this area. Nantucket Sound is generally described or defined as the western limit is defined as where East Shop Lighthouse is. They're kind of halfway across Martha's Vineyard and at the entrance to the harbor of Vineyard Haven. And the eastern border is usually defined as the east coast of Nantucket up to Chatham on Cape Cod. So these are the lighthouses I'm talking about. And I'm going to go more or less in a clockwise circle. So let me get right into it here. And again, I hope we have a little time for discussion or Q&A at the end if any questions come up. But my first lighthouse is East Shop Lighthouse on Martha's Vineyard. And I'm sure probably a lot of you have actually been there. You've probably all been on Martha's Vineyard and maybe visited this lighthouse, but has some interesting history. Before the lighthouse was built, there was a semaphore station there. There's actually a sign near the lighthouse that calls it Telegraph Hill because of the semaphore station. There was a tower that displayed a series of raised and lowered arms and flags that linked the station with other stations in Nantucket, Woods Hole, Plymouth, Duxbury, and Boston, among others. And just to reiterate where it is exactly, it's at the eastern side of the entrance to Vineyard Haven Harbor. This is West Chop Lighthouse over here, this blue marker. Not talking about West Chop because it's just outside the boundaries of Nantucket Sound. Vineyard Sound Harbor, by the way, was historically known as Holmes Hole. Not a very attractive name. I think Vineyard Haven sounds a lot better. A local mariner, I should mention that the reason for the name East Chop, by the way, East Chop and West Chop, that was brought over from England. They talk about the chops of the English Channel. It signifies the entrance to a channel. So the harbor here isn't exactly a channel, but they brought it over, the name over from England. There was a local mariner named Silas Daggett who lobbied for a lighthouse at East Chop, but the authorities thought a single light, being West Chop, was adequate for the harbor. But then in 1869, he took it upon himself to erect his own lighthouse at East Chop, and he built it onto his house, and that's what you're seeing here. He got donations from local merchants for the upkeep of the light. But then the federal government felt that a more substantial lighthouse was needed, so they built this conical cast iron tower, 40 feet tall, in 1878, in that very pretty keeper's house, which is typical of a lot of keeper's houses built in the 1870s and 80s in New England. The lighthouse was painted white at first, but not too much later it was changed to brown, and it got the nickname the Chocolate Lighthouse. People known as the Chocolate Lighthouse for a long time. It remained brown into the 1980s, I believe. I'm not sure exactly when it was painted white again. Here's another early photo of it. George Walter Purdy, P-U-R-D-Y, was keeper here from 1902 to 1934, pretty long stretch. He was a former lobsterman. He had lost an arm in an accident in a boat's engine room, and he also lost his sight in one eye after it was damaged by paint chips. Years after the family left there, his daughter was watching a Coast Guardsman scraping paint from the tower, and she told him, quote, "I know a one-armed man who used to scrape that all by himself," unquote. The man said, "How long did it take him?" And Alice, the daughter, answered, 2 days. The man was pretty amazed by that. That's the one-armed man who would scrape the lighthouse in 2 days. Here's a slightly more recent postcard. The Coast Guard removed all the other buildings when the light was automated in the 50s, leaving the lighthouse standing alone. In 1957, the Coast Guard sold the land around the lighthouse to the town of Oak Bluffs for use as a park. And in 1994, the license was transferred to the Martha's Vineyard Museum, and they still take care of it today. The lighthouse is usually open during the summer or during the spring through to fall on Sunday evenings around sunset. Of course, this year is a little different at a lot of lighthouses and other places, but typically that's what they do, and sometimes open it up for groups like the picture you see there. There's an unusual architectural feature at East Chop Lighthouse. It's one of only a handful of lighthouses that have this. The finials on the what they call the gallery, lantern gallery railing, you know, the catwalk around the top of the lighthouse, the finials are in the form of little cast iron lighthouses. Sure, you probably all know the Nubble Lighthouse up in York, Maine. That has the same feature. But there's only, I think, about 5 or 6 that got that. So I'm going to move on to Edgartown Lighthouse. And in this picture taken from the water, you see the huge, what is it called? The Harborview Hotel in Edgartown. And I'll show you a map of its location at the entrance to the harbor of Edgartown on the east side of Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard, as you probably know, developed a booming whaling industry in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Many of those captains' homes from that era still stand. By the 1800s, more than 100 Edgartown men were captains of whaling ships. The first lighthouse in this spot began service in 1828, and it was a 2-story house, as you see, with a lantern on the roof. And a wooden bridge was built out to the lighthouse. It was a little bit offshore. The walkway to the lighthouse became known locally as the Bridge of Sighs, because men about to leave on whaling voyages would frequently walk out there with their wives or girlfriends before they left on their long voyages. The dwelling and walkway had to be repaired many times through the years. The walkway was often damaged in storms. and the hurricane of September 21st, 1938, worst hurricane in recorded New England history, pretty much finished off the lighthouse. The Coast Guard took over management of lighthouses from the old civilian lighthouse service right around that same time in 1939. And one of the first things they did was demolish this old lighthouse. There were plans to put up a steel skeleton tower, an ugly modern tower. The local Edgartown people were not happy about that. The Coast Guard came up with another plan. They relocated an 1881 cast iron lighthouse from Cranes Beach in Ipswich. I'm sure you probably all know that beach, but not too many people know there was a lighthouse there. This lighthouse stood there for quite a few years, more than 50 years, until it was taken apart and barged across to Martha's Vineyard and set up as the new Edgartown Lighthouse. And the poor people of Ipswich just got a really ugly little skeleton tower in its place. So I think the people of Edgartown had more political clout than the people in Ipswich at that time. In its new location, the 45-foot lighthouse got a modern automatic light flashing red every 6 seconds. Over the years, the sand filled in the area between the lighthouse and the mainland, so today the lighthouse is on a beach. This is a very interesting and unique thing there. A memorial was established at the base of the lighthouse in 2001. The Martha's Vineyard Children's Memorial consists of stones engraved with the names of children who have died, mostly Martha's Vineyard children, along with a part of a poem by Thomas Napoleon. You can see it on the upper picture there. The poem is called A Remembrance of an Unforgotten Vineyard Summer. It's a really touching memorial there. A renovation in 2007 included the installation of a spiral staircase inside the tower. From the time it was moved from Ipswich, all they had in the lighthouse was a ladder up to the top, so it was kind of hard to access the lantern room. But they put in this more proper stairway in 2007. And the lighthouse is open to the public normally in season, but again, not this past season, which was quite different. So this is my next lighthouse, Cape Poge, which is one of the very few wooden lighthouses from the 1800s still standing. There's only a handful. Cape Poge is a windswept point at the northern tip of Chappaquiddick, the island to the east of Martha's Vineyard. And as I mentioned before, Edgartown's whaling business was flourishing early in the 19th century, and Congress felt a light was needed at Cape Poge to help direct traffic into Edgartown Harbor. We don't have any pictures of the first lighthouse. The first lighthouse was built in 1801, a 35-foot wooden tower. It was a really tough place for a family to live. First keeper was not provided a boat, which is pretty surprising. He requested one and was allowed to buy one in late 1802, provided it cost no more than $70. You probably get a pretty good boat in 1802 for $70. The lighthouse was rebuilt in 1844, and that's the lighthouse you see in this picture. Another wooden tower. And then the lighthouse we have today, again, was built in 1893, and there was a really pretty keeper's house that unfortunately no longer exists. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But this lighthouse, since it was built, has had to be moved 4 times because of the eroding land there and changes in the shifting sands, basically. The light was automated in 1943. The last keeper was removed. In 1954, the keeper's house you see here was sold to a private party and torn down for the lumber. And that's pretty heartbreaking. The tower had to be moved. Actually, let me go to the next picture. This is a neat picture. I think during the period it was boarded up before the house was destroyed. The tower had to be moved back about 500 feet from the eroding shoreline in 1987. As you can see here, it was actually picked up by an Army helicopter, which is, I think, pretty amazing. And the lantern you see in the foreground there was restored at that time and was moved separately. The lighthouse can be reached via a 3.5-mile hike from the Dyke Bridge on Chappaquiddick, or it can be reached with a 4-wheel drive vehicle. They have to have a permit for that. It's also open through tours offered by trustees of reservations, and I've done that tour a couple of times. It's an excellent tour. You get to climb the lighthouse, and I'll show you the beautiful stairway. It's a gorgeous wooden stairway in there. and the modern acrylic optic still inactive aids in navigation. Most of the lighthouses I'm talking about tonight are still active aids. So I'm going to move right along here to Sankaty Headlight on Nantucket, which I would say is one of the most iconic lighthouses in New England. And here's its location on the southeast coast of Nantucket. Nantucket, of course, was the world's leading whaling port for about a century, but there were no lighthouses on the east or south coast well into the 19th century, in spite of the high volume shipping traffic and the dangerous shoals offshore. The Nantucket South Shoals are pretty notorious. Funds were finally appropriated in the 1840s. Here's an early picture with, I think those are some tourists by the lighthouse. Early in summer of 1849, schooners brought building materials into Nantucket Harbor, and the materials were carted to the bluff in Sconset. It's Sconset, but nobody calls it that. Everybody calls the village there Sconset. A 53-foot conical brick tower and dwelling were built, and from its earliest days, the towers had that central red band, white with a red band. A beautiful large lens, a second order Fresnel lens, that's Fresnel, you might all know about those, but glass lenses made of multiple prisms that basically magnified and concentrated the light into a very powerful beam that could be seen from many miles. A second order lens, meaning the second to the largest size, was purchased from the Henri Lepaute company in Paris, and Sankaty Head became the first Massachusetts lighthouse with a Fresnel lens, and also the first lighthouse in the United States with a Fresnel lens as part of its original equipment. Of course, by the early 1860s, every lighthouse in the country had Fresnel lenses. This light went into service on February 1st, 1850, and fishermen called it the Blazing Star. And there is that beautiful lens, which was removed many years later and is now at the Nantucket Whaling Museum. And I always call these works of functional art. I think it's just gorgeous. And that lens is in the neighborhood of 8 feet tall. Pretty substantial. It's got those round panels. The lens would rotate around the light source, and of course, I'm probably telling you things you already know, but if you're in a boat and you see and that lens is rotating, you see a flash every time one of those flash panels passes in front of the light source. As Nantucket evolved from a whaling capital to a vacation resort, the lighthouse became a popular attraction. Many people would climb up to the top to enjoy the view and the magnificent lens. The narrow trap door, or scuttle, as it used to be called, that led into the lantern room was widened to allow women with hoop skirts to pass through. These women in this picture don't have hoop skirts, but I don't know if they toured the lighthouse, but I thought that was a pretty amusing thing. This is keeper Eugene Larsen, who was a native of Norway, with some of his daughters there. He went to sea at the age of 16, came to America as a young man in 1901, was principal keeper at Sankaty Head for about 24 years, beginning in 1920. He and his wife, Edvardine, arrived on Nantucket with 2 children, had 5 more daughters during the years of the lighthouse, and there's 4 of them there. Several times during his career at Sankaty Head, Larsen won the coveted lighthouse pennant, which meant he was kept one of the most clean and orderly stations in the district. He also got some national fame when he was featured in a magazine advertisement for the Granger Tobacco Company. But sadly, they spelled his name wrong. It should be Larsen, but they spelled it O-N in the ad. But it's pretty cool to be in a beautiful ad like that. This is keeper Archford Haskins, who is known as Ted Haskins. You see him in the uniform there with his family. He was at Sankaty from 1944 to 47, part of a long lighthouse career at various places, including Boston Light. In September 1944, not long after his family arrived, the Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944 hit the region very hard. And Haskins later recalled, quote, "The tower was rocking so badly that the lens could not revolve, and huge pieces of the facing of the tower fell from it." That is, to me, absolutely amazing, because these masonry towers were built to not do that kind of thing. To hear the tower actually moved in the storm is incredible. And here's another picture of the Haskins children. His daughter, Jeanette Haskins, who's with the long dark hair there in the back, described her philosophy to the late historian Edward Rowe Snow. She said, quote, living as I have has influenced my belief. We have never had a chance to attend church regularly, but when I look at all the beautiful things of nature, I feel my religion lies there. When I light the light, which I do sometimes, I feel as if I am believing and helping God," unquote. Here's a more recent postcard. The old Coast Guard, sorry, I skipped ahead of my notes here. The Fresnel lens was removed in 1950, replaced by modern so-called aero beacons, which you can actually see in this picture. In 1953, the double keeper's house was raised and replaced by this nondescript ranch-style housing. Here's an aerial picture from a little bit earlier, but it shows you how close that station was to the edge of that eroding bluff on Nantucket. The Coast Guard housing and the other buildings had to be moved away from the edge of the bluff, leaving the lighthouse standing alone. And in the fall of 2005, a nonprofit called the Sconset Trust announced that it was working with the Nantucket Historical Association to get ownership of the lighthouse with the goal of moving it to safer ground. And that move happened in 2007. The lighthouse is now next to the fifth hole of the Sankaty Head Golf Course, 250 feet from the bluff's edge, and it is owned by the nonprofit Sconset Trust. This is Rob Benchley, a very prominent photojournalist who lives there at Sconset. Also happens to be the grandson of the late Robert Benchley. Some of you might remember as a great humorist and also a movie actor. But anyway, Rob volunteers for the Sconset Trust as the modern day keeper or caretaker for that lighthouse. He keeps an eye on things there. He also wrote a book about it called Keeping the Light. It's an excellent book, mainly about the move of the lighthouse. Moving along to another lighthouse in Nantucket, Brant Point, America's second oldest light station after Boston Light, which was established in 1716. This one was established in 1746, and a total of 9 different lighthouse structures stood here over the years. And a lot of you might know about the tradition of throwing pennies into the water as you leave on the ferry from Nantucket and you pass Brant Point Lighthouse. You're supposed to throw a penny in the water, which means you will return to Nantucket. I've actually been on the ferry and seen people doing that. Probably not real great for the marine life, but I think it's a long tradition. There's a map showing its location on the west side of the entrance to the harbor at Nantucket, the main harbor. Here's an early drawing of the Nantucket harbor area. Of course, in the 1740s, the whaling industry was growing there. And in 1746, the merchants and mariners voted to erect a lighthouse at Brant Point. The first lighthouse, well, let me put it this way. The lighthouse was destroyed by storms or fire and rebuilt 7 times between 1746 and 1825. And then in 1856, they built this lighthouse, a 47-foot brick tower, along with a new brick keeper's house. And even though this light was replaced, the tower and house still stand as part of Coast Guard Station Brant Point, but that tower has no lantern on top of it anymore. The present Brant Point Lighthouse was built about 600 feet east of the previous one in 1901 and fitted with a 5th order Fresnel lens. Again, another place where the sands are constantly shifting and they just had to get it closer to the channel and to the harbor there. This is a beautiful postcard showing sailboats passing by there, which is a frequent occurrence there. And this photo shows the fog bell tower that used to be there with the bell on the side. A lot of light stations had fog bells. Some of them, of course, had fog horns. The places like this, there was a clockwork type mechanism inside the bell tower. The keeper would have to crank that up every few hours in times of fog. And a striker, a hammer, would hit the bell, usually 1,000-pound bronze bell, would hit it every so many seconds. And if you're out on your boat or ship, you would hear that sound and certain interval between blows of the bell, and that would help tell you your position. Just like the lights, the different fog signals had their own characteristics, so you could tell them apart. This is Keeper Gerald Reed on the left and Assistant Keeper Frank Craig on the right. This picture is 1932. Gerald Reed and his family arrived on Nantucket on Christmas Day in 1926. It's just a neat picture of 2 keepers there. Soon after it was built, the new Brant Point Light was threatened by the sea, so 500 tons of riprap stone, as you can see in this picture, were placed around it on the beach, and the sand is filled in more there around it now. In the year 2000, the Coast Guard had the lighthouse renovated. They hired a contractor out of Manchester, Mass, the Campbell Construction Company, and I went there during that time, took this picture. The foreman for the construction company, Marty Nally, was a friend, and he let me stay for a night at their house he and the crew were renting. At the same time, the Sankaty Head Lighthouse was being painted by the Coast Guard, so it was a good time to be there. Whoops, let me just finish. I guess that was all I want to say about Brant Point. I'm going to move along here to Great Point Light, also in Nantucket. And even though this looks like an old lighthouse, it's actually not, but I'll explain that in a minute. And it is at the northern tip of Nantucket at the end of that very, very long sand spit. And before the opening of the Cape Cod Canal in 1914, the stretch of water between Great Point and Monomoy Island to the north was one of the busiest sections of the Atlantic coast. Nantucket, of course, again, was a big whaling port, but they didn't put a lighthouse at Great Point until 1785. The first lighthouse burned down in 1816, and it was replaced by this one in 1818, 60-foot stone tower and accompanying keeper's house. It's a little hard to see at first glance, but there is a woman standing at the base of the lighthouse there. That is Elsie Grieder. Her husband, Frank Grieder, was at Nantucket at Great Point 1935 to 37. Again, part of a long lighthouse career, just 2 years at Great Point. I interviewed their son, Bill Grieder, some years ago for an article, and Bill told me how he would play golf in the sand at Great Point using a tomato can as the hole. You made your own fun at these places. You had no choice. This is Bill Grieder on the right, and I don't know who the other keeper is there on the left. And, you know, I've looked at this picture many times, so this is the first time I noticed there's a dog there, too. I don't know the dog's name either. Here's the sad part of the story. Great Point Light was automated in the 50s. In 66, the keeper's house was destroyed by a suspicious fire, leaving the old tower standing alone. And then in March 1984, a severe storm destroyed the 1818 lighthouse, leaving this pile of rubble that you see here. The storm had actually broken through the barrier beach and turned Great Point into an island for a while. But the happy part of the story was just a couple of years later, with the help of Senator Ted Kennedy, a replica lighthouse 300 yards west of the old site was finished by a New Bedford company called Hydro Dredge in 1986 at a cost of over $1 million. And in front of Ted Kennedy there, the woman with the white hair is Elsie Grieder, the wife of Keeper Frank Grieder. She was there for that dedication. And here is the new Great Point Lighthouse. So again, it looks like an old lighthouse. It's not. They did a great job with it. They used some of these stone from the old lighthouse. They also kind of mixed that in with modern materials as well. And the old third order Fresnel lens from Great Point is on display outside the Nantucket Shipwreck and Lifesaving Museum. This is Monomoy Point Light, one of the oldest cast iron lighthouses in the world, and one of, I would say, one of the least seen lighthouses in Massachusetts. Some of you, maybe all of you, have probably seen it from the water, but not many people actually get on South Monomoy there. Monomoy is a peninsula extending southward from Chatham at the elbow of the Cape, and at times it's been separated into two islands, North and South Monomoy, but as far as I know, unless it's changed recently, currently it's one island. South of Monomoy is Pollock Rip, a place of very strong tidal currents, and Cape Cod's fifth lighthouse was built at Monomoy Point in 1823. We don't have any pictures of the first lighthouse. It predated photography, but the present cast iron brick line tower was built in 1849. Here's a very early photo of it. It's the second oldest cast iron lighthouse in the country after Juniper Island Light on Lake Champlain in Vermont. It was built in 1847. This is Asa Jones, I think that's how you pronounce his name, a native of the Cape Cod town of Harwich. He was keeper at Monomoy from 1875 to 86. And you see his son there, sitting there, Marrow, M-A-R-O, Marrow Beath Jones, unusual name, kept a diary of his life there that provides really a good glimpse of life at that light station from 1884 to 1886. I'm going to show you a little bit of that. He was about 8 or 9 years old when he did this. I just want to read the bottom part of it, the last 3 entries here. July 4th, 1886. Not much of a 4th of July for me. I never saw as much of an explosion with gunpowder. It is funny that today has been the most lonesome day of the summer. In the PM, the drinkers of Harwich Center came after some quahogs for bait to catch black bass. July 26, Mr. Ben Mallows has got a sort of turtle and it looks like a sea cow. No one knows what it is, not even old whalers, and Papa is going to write a man to come and get it. July 30th, Eddie Marshall came up and said the monster was dead. Thank the Lord we came off for good. The wind was southwest and Mama was seasick. In the bay were the largest waves I ever saw. So you get the feeling he wasn't too crazy about life there. Kind of lonely, probably no other kids around, and again, had no choice but to make your own fun in a place like that. These are the 3 daughters of keeper James Smith. He was a native of Copenhagen, became keeper in 1899. His wife died early in his stay at Monomoy, but his 3 daughters assisted keeper Smith in his duties. In 1904, a reporter asked the sisters if life at the lighthouse was lonely. Annie, the oldest daughter, I believe is the one in the middle, she said, quote, "Oh no, we don't have time to be lonesome. There's always something to do with the housekeeping and the light," unquote. Here's an aerial picture I took a few years ago. With the opening of the Cape Cod Canal in 1914 and an increase in the power of Chatham Light, Monomoy Point Light was considered expendable. It was discontinued in 1923, and today the island and the lighthouse are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And here is Stage Harbor Light. Now you might call it a headless lighthouse. It's privately owned, and I believe somebody with us tonight knows the owner. Maybe we'll talk about that after my presentation. But let me show you a map of where it is. It's in Chatham. And there is a fairly substantial harbor there called Stage Harbor, part of Chatham, named for racks used for drying fish, developed into a busy fishing port in the 1800s. In 1878, the Lighthouse Board recommended a lighthouse on Harding's Beach near the entrance to Stage Harbor to serve as a guide. And this 48-foot cast iron tower was built. You probably noticed that a lot of lighthouses from that area, from the early 1870s into the early 1880s, a lot of them have the same design. Very economical, easy to cast them in a foundry and move them in parts and put them together on the site. So they built this in 1878. I'm sorry, it went into service in 1880, actually. Here's keeper Alfred Howard. He was keeper 1906 to 1916. He was involved in several rescues. Let me show you another really neat picture with his wife and daughter. And looks like a fun-loving dog there. In December 1914, Captain Ephraim Smith of Chatham wrote to the lighthouse authorities in Boston describing Howard's latest act of heroism. Quote, "I deem it my duty to report to you the valuable assistance rendered me by Alfred A. Howard, keeper, Stage Harbor Light Station, in saving my horse from drowning, also supplying my man with rubber boots and dry stockings. And as he would not take money for his very kind service, I take these means to write you for your kind consideration towards commending him for his prompt and efficient aid towards saving my pet and valuable property," unquote. I thought that was pretty good because a lot of times these keepers got no thanks at all for rescuing people. And keepers often were involved in rescues. So the lighthouse was deactivated in 1933, replaced by an automatic light on a steel skeleton tower nearby. The lantern was removed and the property was auctioned. The first buyer was Henry Sears Hoyt. He wrote in Yankee Magazine, quote, "A more desolate spot would be hard to imagine. A howling gale whistling around angry sea, but nevertheless a grand place," unquote. Here's a picture I took when I walked out on Harding's Beach one time. It is, again, still privately owned, so it's off limits to the public, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that when I finish here. And I'll move on to Chatham Light, which is now part of Coast Guard Station Chatham. And here's a map showing its location. We're at the very elbow of the Cape there. Maritime traffic passing the Cape was extremely heavy by the 19th century, and the waters off Chatham were really a menace with very strong currents and dangerous shoals. The light station established at Chatham in 1808 was the second on Cape Cod after Highland Light, North Truro. It was decided there'd be two lights to differentiate the station from Highland Light. Originally, two octagonal wooden towers were erected on movable wooden skids, but the station was rebuilt in 1841 with two 30-foot brick towers, and that's what you see here. In this older picture, you see the so-called birdcage style lanterns. That's a very old style lantern. Very few of those still exist in the country. Changed a little bit later to these more modern style lanterns. This is Josiah Hardy, who was keeper at Chatham from 1872 to 1879. Let me show you a later picture of him. And if this guy doesn't look like an old salt, I don't know who does. In 1875, Keeper Hardy counted 16,000 vessels passing the lighthouse. He reported often on serious erosion problems there, but basically nothing was done for a long time to shore up the eroding cliff. By 1877, the light towers stood only 48 feet from the edge, so they built two new 48-foot conical cast iron towers in 1877 across the road from the old location. And the old lighthouses were actually allowed to fall down the edge of the bluff eventually. Later, by the early 1900s, the lighthouse service officials and the government were decided that two light stations, and there were 7 on the East Coast, they decided that those were unnecessary and didn't want to spend that extra money. So in Chatham, the North Light was discontinued and actually taken apart and moved up the coast to Eastham to replace the survivor of what they used to call the Three Sisters, 3 lighthouses in Eastham. That was in 1923. So that lighthouse with the red band you see on the Cape Cod potato chip bag, but that's a Nauset Light in Eastham. That used to be the other light at Chatham. In 1969, the Fresnel lens and lantern were removed from Chatham Light. They put in these modern DCBs or aerobeacon type lights. And for a while it had a 2.8 million candle power light, one of the most powerful in the country. And a new larger lantern was installed to accommodate the larger apparatus. That's why the lighthouse today looks different from a traditional lighthouse. The old lantern and lens, 4th order Fresnel lens, were put on display on the grounds of the Chatham Historical Society's Atwood House Museum, just a few minutes from the lighthouse. The Coast Guard Auxiliary, by the way, runs open houses at Chatham Light, at least a few times each summer, but again, I don't think they had any this past summer. This is originally the Bass River Lighthouse, but today the Lighthouse Inn in West Dennis. The central part of the building here is the original lighthouse, and everything else was added on. Here's the location in West Dennis near the entrance to the Bass River. Bass River had salt works and facilities for building small vessels and people involved in fishing and coastal trade. The construction of this lighthouse took place in 1854 and 55. Oxen hauled building materials through the local marshes. The lighthouse consisted of, as you can see, a 2-story wood frame dwelling with the lantern on the roof. Warren Crowell, who had been wounded and taken prisoner in Virginia during the Civil War, became keeper here in 1869. He was there for 11 years. Before there was a lighthouse, Crowell had aided local navigation by keeping a light in his attic window, and then he became the first keeper of the actual lighthouse. The government deemed the lighthouse unnecessary once the Cape Cod Canal was opened, and this lighthouse was extinguished for good. Well, not quite for good, as I'll tell you, but on June 15th, 1914. The property was sold at auction. Harry Noyes, N-O-Y-E-S, who owned a car dealership in Boston, used it as a summer residence for a while. He expanded the main house, added some new buildings. In 1938, it was bought by State Senator Everett Stone and his wife. The Stones had a lot of guests at the lighthouse, and their hospitality became so well known that they eventually opened it to the public as the Lighthouse Inn. In 1939, a night's stay for 2, including 3 meals at the Lighthouse Inn, cost $5. Everett and Gladys Stone's son, Bob, became the first head of the food service for the inn. Bob Stone hired 3 waitresses from Wheaton College. One of them was Mary Packard of Brockton, Mass., and Bob and Mary married in 1942. Mary Stone later recalled, when I interviewed her about 15 years ago. She recalled that during World War II, American planes bombed the rocks near the inn for practice. The guests would go out in their chairs and cheer the show, cheer each explosion. There's a lot of hurricane damage in the Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944. This is these photos show the damage from that one, and another one did a lot of, actually two hurricanes in 1954 did more damage, and Hurricane Bob in 91 also did quite a bit of damage there, but it's always been repaired. This is Mary Stone, the wife of Bob Stone, and Bob Stone passed away quite a few years ago, but Mary just passed away a couple of years ago. Again, I interviewed her 15 or so years ago, and here she's sitting in the parlor there at the Lighthouse Inn, and they're just really nice people. The family remains involved. Their son Greg is the president, and his wife Patricia is the general manager of the inn. There's the modern acrylic optic that was installed in 1989. Greg Stone felt that it would be nice to have an aid to navigation there again, and so it was made a seasonal private aid to navigation, 300 millimeter optic, white light flashing every 6 seconds. And it's on the Coast Guard list, although it's a private aid, and it just operates in summer. And it's designated the West Dennis Inn on the light list, which is, I'm sorry, the West Dennis Light. It's kind of confusing. It was originally Bass River Light, became the Lighthouse Inn, and now the light itself is called the West Dennis Light. The inn offers tours for schools, and the public can get a tour of the lighthouse part of the building if staff is available. They're pretty good about that. This is Point Gammon Lighthouse. To me, it looks like a medieval watchtower, and it's actually one of the oldest standing lighthouses in the country. It is privately owned. Point Gammon is at the southern tip of Great Island in West Yarmouth, on the east side of the approach to Hyannis Harbor. As the port of Hyannis grew in importance, it was obvious that a lighthouse was needed there to help mariners into the harbor. And the first lighthouse, well, actually the only lighthouse, went into service in 1816. The conical tower and dwelling were made of stone. First keeper Samuel Adams Peake died in 1824, and his teenage son John took over and stayed for 34 years. And 1858 was when the light was discontinued. John Peake and his wife raised 9 children at the lighthouse, 2 of whom became lighthouse keepers. When his children were of school age, they would walk 6 miles each way to go to school every day, 12 miles total. Here's a later postcard. In 1858, the lighthouse was replaced by Bishop and Clerks Light offshore. You see it in the distance there. In 1882, Great Island was sold to Charles Corey, an ornithologist from Boston. Corey established a game preserve on the island with elk, deer, antelopes, pheasants, and other animals, so hunters could go there, but non-game birds were protected, and thus Point Gammon was one of the nation's early bird sanctuaries. Corey replaced the lighthouse lantern with a taller structure on top, transforming it into an observation tower for nature watching. And that's what it looks like now. I've only been on the Great Island once. I knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, basically, so I was able to get on there. Malcolm Chase, a banker from Rhode Island who visited Great Island as a boy, purchased the property in 1914, and most of Great Island still remains in the ownership of that family. So it is completely off limits to the public. This is Bishop and Clerks Light, the only lost light I'm talking about. This was what I would call a classic granite wave-swept lighthouse. And here is a map showing where it was off of Point Gammon. The ledges in that area were considered a scourge to mariners traveling near Hyannis, south of Cape Cod. One writer called them the Scylla and Charybdis of Nantucket Sound, or Charybdis. I think I've heard it pronounced both ways, not sure. Here's the plans for the lighthouse. The Congress appropriated funds for a lighthouse in 1856. The building of it was a difficult process, similar to the building of Minot's Ledge Light, one you're probably all familiar with, just south of Boston Harbor, and Edgartown Light in England, another similar one. The work began in the spring of 1857. The massive granite blocks were cut on shore, ferried to the site, and put together on the cylindrical base. It went into service in 1858, and Point Gammon Light was extinguished when this new light went into service. The lighthouse had an automatic fog bell operated by a clockwork mechanism, and that was all housed in that structure you see attached to the lighthouse. Wooden addition on the side there. A principal keeper and 2 assistants usually were normally there. Usually only 2 men would be on duty at the lighthouse at the same time. And they lived inside the tower, obviously no room for a keeper's house here. And there was a kitchen and 2 bedrooms inside. Excuse me. This is one of my all-time favorite lighthouse keeper photos. This is Captain Charles H. Hinckley, a native of Barnstable. He was an assistant keeper from 1881 to 84, left for a few years somewhere else and came back as principal keeper at Bishop and Clerks in 1892. His wife would sometimes visit to stay there with her husband, and Hinckley remained at the lighthouse until 1919 when he was 70. He was 4'9", or according to one article, 4'6" in his stocking feet, and he's been called the shortest lighthouse keeper in the world. In this picture, the other man is Walter Carney, a local ferry captain who was 6'7", ferry captain out of Hyannis. Hinckley referred to himself and Carney as the long and short of the service. Hinckley was interviewed by the Boston Herald in 1907, and also by a magazine called Along the Coast in 1909. I love one quote from that article, quote, "There ain't a great deal of me so far as height goes, but I'm all right from my feet up. I've laid many a man bigger than me on his back, if I do say it myself," unquote. I wouldn't mess with him. It looks like the leaning lighthouse of Cape Cod here. The lighthouse was discontinued in 1928. It suffered from the battering from the sea as well as vandalism. By 1952, it was tilting to one side, was missing many blocks, as you see here. So the Coast Guard decided to demolish the structure. Dynamite was placed strategically in drilled holes. Hundreds of people in pleasure craft were watching. September 11th, 1952, a tugboat flew a red flag of warning, and then when the time came, 12:57 p.m., the tug blew 6 blasts on its whistle. The Boston Globe described it, quote, "A cloud of smoke partly hid the old tower, which stood swaying for a moment and then toppled to one side like a pile of child's blocks. The historic Bishop and Clerks Lighthouse was no more." And that's all that was left after that demolition. And they cleared off the base and put this thing in its place. So there is still a lighted automatic light there. You see the solar panels there. Somehow not quite as attractive as the old lighthouses, but I guess it serves the purpose. This is Hyannis Harbor Lighthouse, the last lighthouse I'm talking about. Certainly doesn't look like a traditional lighthouse or keeper's house, but it is a historic light station. You see the oversized lantern room on it. It's been drastically remodeled, both the tower and house, but again, very old station. Hyannis grew into a busy port in the 1800s, and of course today it's the largest community on Cape Cod. The first light in the harbor was a privately built shack on the beach with a lamp that hung in its window, and the son of the man who built the shack often kept the light. He would go out there with his dog and spend the night. In 1848, Congress authorized the building of a proper lighthouse at South Hyannis. Excuse me, this is an early photo of it, and it was supposedly a 19-foot tower to the base of the lantern, but based on the man standing there, it looks a little taller than that. But anyway, conical brick tower, went into service in 1849, had another one of those birdcage-style lanterns. On the left is John Lothrop of Hyannis. He became keeper in 1871 after a long career as a harbor pilot, helping to guide vessels from Maine to Virginia. He was assisted by his son, Alonzo, who you see here. Alonzo Freeman Lothrop became keeper after his father's death in 1878, stayed there until 1899. So there was just about 3 decades of the Lothrop family at Hyannis Lighthouse. And that's a great studio photo of keeper Alonzo Lothrop there. And you see the K on his lapel. That signified that he was the principal keeper. So, of course, some lighthouses had more than one keeper. If you were first assistant, it would say 1 on the lapels, second assistant, a 2. But the K always signified that you were the principal keeper, or head keeper. Here's a later picture with a more modern style lantern on the lighthouse. Hyannis Harbor Light was discontinued in 1929. The lantern was removed. A.W. Fuller bought the lighthouse at auction for about $7,000. It's passed through several hands, and the present owners, James Hyland and Alan Granby, Janice Hyland and Alan Granby, are antiques dealers, and they built a new top for the tower. It's not exactly traditional, but they say it's a great place to watch sunsets with maybe a cocktail in your hand. Here it is. It does look like a great place to sit at sunset. This is taken from a beach there called Keys Beach in Hyannis. So I'm pretty much done. I just want to mention, Spencer, when he introduced me, mentioned my podcast. This is the official, I don't know if you call it a logo or what, for the podcast. Again, it's called Lighthearted. That signifies people who have lighthouses in their hearts. I've been doing it for about a year and a half, and I'm up to about 100 episodes, interviews with people involved in lighthouse preservation, authors. I just interviewed a children's book author today. I've interviewed ex-lighthouse keepers in Ireland and Scotland, as well as in this country. So I'm having a lot of fun with it. You can find it. I'll show the website in a second. Or if you have a podcast app in your smartphone, just search for Lighthearted, 2 words, and you'll find it. So here's some sources of information. My own website is New England Lighthouses, a virtual guide, newenglandlighthouses.net. The American Lighthouse Foundation, which I'm the president of the board of that organization, lighthousefoundation.org. The foundation takes care of 17 lighthouses in the Northeast, from Connecticut up to northern Maine. It's been around for more than 25 years, and I recommend that you check out that website. The American Lighthouse Foundation has put, I think it's now over $4 million into lighthouse preservation. There's about 10 chapters around New England. I founded the local chapter here. I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I founded Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses, which takes care of 2 local lighthouses, including the one that I'm using as my background today, Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse. And I am also very involved with the U.S. Lighthouse Society. The podcast I do is for them. That's based in Washington State. Another one of the great national lighthouse organizations. Go to lighthousesociety.org. They do a lot of different things, so check that out. And the news blog, news.uslhs.org, is where you can listen to the podcast. The podcast is kind of mixed in with news stories and things. And there's some books I recommend. And I'll tell you that if you want to read the best overview of American lighthouses, Brilliant Beacons by Eric J. Dolan, is just a great book. Just came out a couple of years ago. And I interviewed Eric for one episode of my podcast. And I thought I'd just close by playing a quick audio clip of Eric J. Dolan, who's a leading maritime historian. His book Leviathan is about the history of whaling in this country. He's written several really excellent books, mostly on maritime history. So I'm just going to play a quick clip of Eric here.
I'm absolutely amazed and totally impressed by the work that people have done to save and protect these historical icons, these sentinels of the coast. I visited a lot more lighthouses after I wrote the book than I did before I had written the book, and I was always incredibly impressed at the small and sometimes quite sizable museums that are associated with lighthouses, the very dedicated people who work there, volunteer their time, and also work at the lighthouses. I really was blown away by the drive and determination of these people to not let an important part of our history go by the way.
Whoops. Sorry about that. Didn't quite go by the wayside, and that was the end of his quote. So I clicked when I shouldn't have clicked. And I'm going to get out of sharing here. Stop share. And here I am. So
you had one quick photograph to end there, Jeremy,
yeah,
and maybe you could espouse on that. But I do. There are no further questions that have been asked in the Q&A.
Okay.
So we can do one of two things. We can, Paul. I don't see anyone raising their hand at this point. If someone would like to do that, we can certainly unmute you and add you as a participant and allow you to ask your question in person. One of the questions that came to mind for me was, is there a rationale, a design element, an engineering requirement because that all the lighthouses are circular in design?
Oh.
Or is it just common manufacturing process or building process?
Well, first of all, most are round, but there's actually a lot of square lighthouses. Actually, in Provincetown in Cape Cod, there are 2 square lighthouses, Wood End and Long Point. Hospital Point Lighthouse in Beverly, some people might know that. It's the home of the admiral in charge of the 1st Coast Guard District. That's a square tower. So generally, I think traditionally there were round towers. I think the belief is often that in bad storms, the wind kind of just goes around it. It's like less wind resistance. So I don't really know why they decided to build some lighthouses square, to be honest with you. But square lighthouse towers are not unusual at all. There are so many different styles of lighthouses. Obviously, as I showed you, some of them were keepers' houses with a lantern on the roof. There's still some of those around. Basically was whatever was in vogue, whatever architects and engineers were working for the federal government, in the lighthouse service, whatever they liked. So the styles changed every few years, and you'll kind of get clusters of lighthouses like these cast iron towers like Portsmouth Harbor behind me, and several on the Cape and the islands that are very similar, that were built within a few years of each other. So I don't know if I answered your question at all, but I think
I was curious. I mean, the predominance of them they're circular, and it does make sense that they could withstand the environments that they are in, which tend to be wind prone and very exposed. So it makes sense from that standpoint.
So the picture I showed for a flash there was emailed to me by Richard Batchelder, who's with us tonight. And maybe he wants to say something about it. I can get it back on the screen, but it's an actual lighthouse service clock from Stage Harbor Light. I believe he has a big personal association with that lighthouse. So I don't know is Richard still with us?
We'd have to rely on Paul to see if he could release him. Here he is. Our illustrious president has joined us. Hello, Richard.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can. Thank you very much.
Let me get back to the picture.
Well, first of all, thanks to John Appleton and the rest of the Crown and Shield Yacht Squadron, and glad we could still have this discussion today. And Jeremy, terrific presentation. I sent this to Jeremy. It's a Seth Thomas regulator, 8-day regulator clock. And if you look closely, you'll see that it has USLHE on the dial. It's the original dial, and it stands for the United States Lighthouse Establishment, which was the predecessor to the Coast Guard. And this clock was in the keeper's house at Stage Harbor Light, which I actually look out on from my house in Chatham. So this clock literally faces its old location. The second to last keeper of the Stage Harbor Light hanged himself in 1919, and his son became keeper. He actually hanged himself out in a shed near the lighthouse. His son took over and was the last keeper, and in 1933, when the lighthouse was decommissioned, the Coast Guard said he could take the clock with him, and he did. And it was purchased by a Seth Thomas clock collector back in the 60s in South Carolina, and I was able to purchase it from him. So a little bit of history. And the family, Jeremy mentioned Henry Sears Hoyt, who bought the lighthouse from the government. Hoyt's family still owns the property. It's never changed hands, and they have very strict rules. It's no electricity and so forth. It's kept exactly as it was, and they have a work week every summer where all the people in the extended family, if they want to have any rights to stay at the lighthouse over the course of the year, they have to come and help do maintenance and painting and so on and so forth. And it's just a iconic piece of Chatham, and it's nice to have a little memory of that here in my home. So that's it for me.
That's a great piece.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, in lieu of having you in person, Jeremy, which we would normally do, I think that at the end of a presentation, we would give a loud round of applause. And since it is Richard and I, the only ones, and Paul, the only ones that have a voice on this Zoom call, I will give you a round of applause for the work that you did tonight. Thank you so very much.
Thank you
for participating and making our evening richer and grander. It is a great way to start the new year. And I just, I want to say healthy living to all. I hope 2021 you stay healthy and that we get back to some sense of normalcy so that we can all gather again. We miss our camaraderie and we miss our time together at the Somerset Club. So thank you very, very much for your time and presentation tonight.
Thank you so much.
And without further ado, I don't see any other questions. So with that, I will bid you adieu and have a wonderful evening, everybody. Paul, thank you very much for running this. And Jeremy, thank you again.